Presenting this episode of Doc Talk with Dr. Bond is guest host attorney Van Vu.
Hello, my name is Van Vu, and today's topic is there really a shortage of hydroxychloroquine? Now let me give you a little bit of information about my background so that you know through what lens I see things. I am Dr. Bond's wife, but for over the last 20 years, I have been an attorney and I've been representing public agencies at the local, county, and state level. One of my areas is really ensuring that public resources make it to the public in a way that is consistent with the mandates of the law. So when I saw the issues arise regarding access to these particular drugs for treatment of COVID-19, it really did pique my interest, as well as what the government was doing in order to ensure that this treatment was made available if that was what it deemed to be in the interest of the public, consistent with its mandate. So let me just focus on what I'm not going to be talking about today. This is a two-part series. This is part one, and during this particular talk, I am looking at access to the drugs. The second part, we'll talk a little bit more about state intervention in an effort to limit that access to these particular drugs for certain purposes. But what I'm not going to be talking about in this particular podcast and video is the medical debate. I'm not going to cover whether or not hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine should be used from a research perspective to treat COVID-19. Instead, my focus is on the legality and the access. We know that the FDA has not approved either of these drugs for the particular indication of treatment of COVID-19. But we do also know that the federal government, through Vice President Pence, has acknowledged the ability for off-label prescribing of this drug. Now, recently at the end of March, the FDA did issue the EUA, which is the Emergency Use Authorization, and that EUA was primarily targeted at enabling the federal government to actually receive donations of these drugs from private companies, manufacturing companies. And once the government receives that into its strategic national stockpile, it becomes federal property in order to be able to disperse to the public in this time of emergency during this pandemic. A couple of other legal issues that are coming up that I've seen that really is integral, I think, to this issue is the legitimate medical purpose standard. There's been a lot of dialogue, and you've heard Dr. Bond talk about the difficulties had getting the prescriptions that he's written dispensed to his patients. Many state governments have laws that indicate that pharmacists can, in fact, decline to dispense drugs if the pharmacist believes in its professional judgment that the prescription was not for a legitimate medical purpose. Now, how that's defined, we can get into at a later time, but some of the questions that have come up is that what if the doctor writes it for prevention or prophylaxis? Is that a legitimate medical purpose? Some states say no. At least one state says potentially yes, and we'll talk about that in part two. The other part is whether or not these drugs should be written for this particular purpose, namely to treat COVID-19. And because that is still very much a debate out there in the world, some pharmacists have declined to fill it without certain types of levels of proof. Or they're restricting it to patients that are in the hospitals on an outpatient basis. Another issue that's less legal but more practical is this discussion about physician hoarding and whether or not that has affected the supply chain and affected people's access, both people who are on COVID-19 treatments as well as people who with rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. So these two last parts are really the focus of parts 1 and 2 of this particular series. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the history of this pandemic so that we understand the timelines, because as you'll see with the shortage issues, the timeline is very, very important. Now, the coronavirus came up and became COVID-19 in November of 2019. That was when we are told that the first case came up in China, where there was a man who had pneumonia from an unknown origin. It appears as though the Chinese were monitoring that case and other cases that were coming up and eventually notified the World Health Organization. In January of 2020, January 20th or 21st of 2020, we received the first case in the U.S. in Washington State. And that was specifically a person who returned from the trip to China and brought the coronavirus back from China. Also in January, there were two things that happened in which China was notifying the world that this was a new coronavirus. One was an article that they published called The Discovery of Novel Coronavirus Associated with Recent Pneumonia Outbreak in Humans and Its Potential Bat Origin. Now, this publication was made on the internet, and it was spread out worldwide so that it could provide information to the world that there was potentially a new coronavirus. The Chinese also published another article in the journal Lancet, which is a major scientific publication, that identified the characteristics at that time of 41 patients that they had in Wuhan, China, that had the new virus. And so this was actually really helpful information because it talked about a lot of the medical data that they were gathering from these patients that were in the hospital. But both of those were indicators to the world that, hey, there's a new virus on the block and that it is potentially a bad one. At the end of January 30th, 2020, the outbreak was declared by the World Health Organization as a public health emergency of international concern. So this was no longer just an issue within China, but we knew that this was going to be an issue that was going to be a problem for the entire world. Right on the heels of that, the U.S. Health and Human Services Agency declared the public health emergency regarding the COVID-19 outbreak as well. At the time, it was just called coronavirus. So moving on, once this virus had been identified and it became a thing that the world and the country within the United States here should be concerned about, then what was happening was there was a race for research and to share scientific knowledge. Now, it started out with a lot of in vitro studies. In fact, in China, the Chinese researchers published a letter to the editor of the journal Cell Research, again, a major publication that shared the information regarding their in vitro studies using chloroquine and another drug called remdesivir for COVID-19. So this was interesting because this is where the Chinese were within a lab setting trying to figure out what kinds of drugs should be tried on humans based on past experiences with other coronaviruses and illnesses and viruses. The researchers were recommending at that point, given the in vitro studies, to use some of these drugs on human subjects because of the promise that it showed within a cell culture. On February 11th, 2020, the virus then gets its official name from the World Health Organization. It was called Coronavirus Disease 2019, and that's what we call COVID-19 for short. On January 7th, 2020, on the heels of the in vitro studies from China, China started the human studies and began to test chloroquine as a treatment. Now, look at this timeline. This is the beginning of February when this is happening. And they actually registered this trial within clinicaltrials.gov, which is a database that worldwide researchers do register in order to show what kind of research is being done. Moving on towards the middle to end of February, the Chinese researchers published the first study that chloroquine actually had efficacy in treating pneumonia-related COVID-19. So this was the first study that came out regarding human studies. Right the very next day, the Chinese government issued what they called an expert consensus. They were looking at the results of the human studies and saw that there was, in fact, promise with using chloroquine as a treatment. And so they came up with a protocol for use moving forward in order to continue on with testing, but also treating patients within their hospitals. A couple of weeks after that, at the beginning of March, on March 3rd, the French published what looked like a lit review. Namely, they looked at the literature and the science in the past, and then they hypothesized about what the mechanisms were, why chloroquine was working in order to treat the pneumonia that was related to COVID-19 in the Chinese population. So once they knew what was going on there, then it was recommended by the French to move forward with their human studies. At the beginning of March also, March 9th, 2020, the Chinese published their in vitro study, this time comparing chloroquine with hydroxychloroquine. So this is one of the early times when hydroxychloroquine came into the picture, at the beginning of March. Based on those in vitro studies in the lab in a petri dish, the Chinese concluded that hydroxychloroquine actually was more effective to treat COVID-19 than chloroquine was. A few days after that, we heard from the South Koreans, where their equivalent of the CDC recommended using hydroxychloroquine with another HIV drug in combination as a possible treatment for COVID-19. So, as you can see here, there was a shift from February focusing on chloroquine to March focusing on hydroxychloroquine. Right around March 16th, the French study was completed related to the use of hydroxychloroquine for treatment, and they combined that with azithromycin for the treatment of COVID-19, and that is what hit the news here in the United States. Once the Chinese, the South Koreans, and the French were informing the world about potential treatments for COVID-19, namely that chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine could be used in order to ease the symptoms or slow down the progression of this particular virus, then suddenly the whole world was listening. So that led to what we believe were a number of shortages here in the United States. So let's go ahead and take a look at that timeline. Now, a lot of the information that I'm getting is about purchasing patterns by a company called Premier Inc. And what they do is they supply analysis for purchasing organizations such as hospitals, 4,000 hospitals in fact, throughout the United States. So by way of a company that has their pulse on what buying patterns are for various drugs and medical supplies, this is a company that can speak from a place of knowledge. Well, as we previously discussed, there was a lot going on in the world and, related to this race to finding a treatment. One of the things that we know about drugs here in the United States is that there are two agencies that basically report on shortages. The first one is the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, and they get their information through a database that's compiled through the University of Utah at Salt Lake City. Often, this information comes out ahead of FDA information because the FDA also does a drug shortage list. What we know about chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine is that the American Society of Health System Pharmacists reported the shortages a lot earlier in time than the FDA did. So let's look at that timeline. What we do know is that in February of 2020, like I said, the Chinese were conducting human studies with the use of chloroquine as a treatment, and they also came up with an expert consensus regarding what the protocol should be for the use of chloroquine. We also know that the French did their lit review regarding chloroquine and hypothesized as to what the mechanism was behind the efficacy of this particular drug for treating COVID-19. By the time that came out, the world was looking at chloroquine as, hey, maybe this is a useful treatment. And so what we found within the United States is on March 9th, 2020, the American Society of Health System Pharmacists reported that there was a shortage of chloroquine here in the United States. What also happened on March 9th was that's when the Chinese did their in vitro study or released the information regarding the comparison between chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. So now we're going on this path towards hydroxychloroquine as a treatment. And we see that the South Koreans also published their findings regarding hydroxychloroquine in addition to an HIV drug for the use of COVID-19 treatment. The French, after doing their lit review, also did their own human studies, and that human study ended around March 16th, and their first publication or release of that information was around March 17th, even though it wasn't widely published before around that time. So here we are by March 17th, seeing that the world now is shifting over towards looking at hydroxychloroquine as the better option. And then, of course, a couple of days later, we get the notice from the American Society of Health System Pharmacists that, in fact, hydroxychloroquine is now on the shortage list. Incidentally, what's interesting to point out is that a lot of people associate the shortages with something that President Trump did, namely speaking about these drugs in various press conferences. But the first time that he actually brought up these as potential remedies or treatments was in a press conference around March 19th, 2020. And that was after both of these shortages had already occurred. Now, let's look at what happened in order to make these shortages. Here, what we have is that through the analysis by Premier Inc. of hospital purchasing between March 1st and March 17th of 2020, chloroquine was purchased at 3,000% increase, and that was based on a comparison of what was sold on average before that point. So the past average sold was about 149 units per month at various hospitals, and during that particular time period, the purchasing went up to 2,357 units that were purchased instead. And in terms of chloroquine, there are 3 FDA approved manufacturers that actually does produce chloroquine, including Bayer. In terms of hydroxychloroquine, what the Premier was seeing was that there was a 260% increase. And just to point out, in the United States alone, chloroquine is not as often used as hydroxychloroquine. The volume is by far more along the lines of the hydroxychloroquine. So even though past averages were about 8,800 units per month purchased per hospital, during this time period alone, these 17 days in March, that purchasing jumped up to 16,110 units on average. Just also to give you the background, around 8 to 9 manufacturers that are FDA approved do produce hydroxychloroquine within the United States. So as you can see here, the hospitals were actually the ones purchasing up these 2 drugs that led to the shortages that occurred on March 9th and March 19th that was reported out by the Pharmacy Association. So here's a quote from the Senior Director of Advocacy over at Premier Inc., Ms. Saha. And what she says is we're seeing hoarding as hospitals are very concerned that they have access to the right drugs. She also says that in merely 17 days, U.S. hospitals purchased more chloroquine than they did in all of last year. This caused a domino effect. And at that point, by mid-March, there was a wholesale distribution channels had been entirely depleted of their hydroxychloroquine supply. Some hospitals who were unable to obtain hydroxychloroquine looked to chloroquine as well and saw that both hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine were in fact on the shortage list and were more difficult to find. In response to these shortages or these huge spikes or increases in demand, the drug manufacturers put the drugs on what they call allocation. And that allocation means that they limit the purchases to historic levels so that they can then offer the supply to as many sources and hospitals as possible so that it's not all hoarded by a small number of facilities. It's important to point out that during this time period when both of these drugs had been identified as being on the shortage list, a number of events occurred in the United States that also affected the supply. As we had spoken about, both hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine were already placed on the allocation list by the drug manufacturers. The pharmacy organization reported out the shortage of both hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine by that point. But President Trump, spoke of hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine around the 19th, which drew attention to both of those drugs by the American people who were not following as closely the research that was going out of China, France, and South Korea. The media then also started covering a French study related to the hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin cocktail treatment in its human studies. Seeing what was happening, a number of drug companies stepped up. Teva donated about 6 million doses of their hydroxychloroquine to the United States. That represented, I believe, all of the hydroxychloroquine that they had in stock, and Teva is an Israeli company. Novartis, also known as Sandoz, they also informed the United States that they were donating 30 million doses of their hydroxychloroquine to the United States as well, in addition to another 100 million to the rest of the world. Rising Pharmaceuticals donated 1 million of their hydroxychloroquine to the United States, and also Bayer donated 3 million units of chloroquine to the United States. And around this time, around March 18th, 19th at the latest, the federal government was also ordering millions of units in an unspecified number. That was all that President Trump said in the press conference, was that it in fact was millions of units of hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine from Bayer and 2 other companies. It's interesting because Teva indicated at that time that they were also going to donate another 10 million more doses of hydroxychloroquine by the end of April, bringing their total up to 16 million that they were going to donate. Mylan, a company out of Virginia and West Virginia, indicated in a press conference that they were going to ramp up the production of hydroxychloroquine so that they would produce 50 million doses by mid-April, knowing that there was an increase in demand and a need for that. And Amneal, also another pharmaceutical company, indicated in a press conference that they were going to make another 20 million by mid-April of hydroxychloroquine to make it available. So let's look at all of this. With all of these donations, how much hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, in fact, does the federal government and government agencies have by way of a promise from these manufacturers of drugs? Now, if you look at Teva's promise of 6 million plus an additional 10 million by the end of April, you've got 16 million there of hydroxychloroquine. Novartis with their 30 million, Rising Pharmaceuticals with their 1 million. That totals 47 million doses of hydroxychloroquine that's donated or will be donated to the federal government. In terms of chloroquine, we have the 3 million from Bayer. So the total doses of both drugs is about 50 million. This 50 million doses of drugs are really only the ones that are donated by the drug companies, and it does not include the unspecified millions of doses that were ordered by the feds. So let's put this into perspective. How many people can these donations serve? If we look at the 47 million doses of hydroxychloroquine alone, that can serve between 2.94 million to 3.92 million people. And this is how I got this number. The emergency use authorization of the FDA recommended a protocol of 400 milligrams 2 times a day for day 1, and then 400 milligrams 1 time a day for days 2 through 5 or days 2 through 7, depending upon whether or not the recommendation was 5 or 7 days. Because the pills are 200 milligram pills, that means the entire protocol requires anywhere between 12 to 16 pills, depending upon whether it's a 5 or a 7-day protocol. If you divide 47 million with 12 or 16, you get 2.94 million people who can be served on a 7-day protocol, and 3.92 million people that can be served on a 5-day protocol. So that's quite a few people that can be served by the amount of donations alone that's held by the federal government. So what does that mean for everyone else? Okay, because obviously we as consumers have to go through a doctor and on an outpatient basis, and then we have to get our prescriptions filled at a pharmacy. So are there drugs that are available to the pharmacies for dispensing? For that, we look at the FDA's drug shortage data. And this was updated on March 31st and again on the 2nd and the 3rd of April. And what we see is that hydroxychloroquine is made by 9 different manufacturers. Those are the top blue numbers. Most of these manufacturers have them available, either completely available or on allocation, which means that they have it in stock, but they're limiting the amount of purchases to historical numbers. So if a hospital purchased 1,000 units the same month last year, then they would be limited to 1,000 units on an order, and they can't go above that amount. So what we see here is that, let's say number 9 at the very bottom, what I wanted to point out there is that that's a company from India. And on March 25th, India actually put a ban on exports of both of these drugs. This company, Zydus, is one of the largest manufacturers of this drug in the world. They're one of several, actually, that produces it out of India. Zydus had indicated earlier on in March that it was ramping up production of hydroxychloroquine, knowing that there was going to be this increased demand based on the research that was coming out. So Zydus alone can produce 200 million doses per month out of their facilities. Once the ban is lifted, that's the kind of volume that you can see being produced out of that one facility alone. You can see that there's a couple of companies here that we had previously talked about, including Mylan and Amneal, that had indicated in press releases that they were going to be producing large quantities as well. Mylan, for example, is going to have 50 million by mid-April, and Amneal is going to have about 20 million doses by mid-April available as well. And both of these companies indicate availability of hydroxychloroquine. Chloroquine, according to the FDA, is also available, but it's coming out of a company that is based in India. So we might run into that same problem. But what's interesting is that the FDA database does not include Bayer, which does produce chloroquine as well as probably one other company that produces chloroquine. So according to at least the FDA database, there are drugs available for purchase at pharmacies and outpatient basis in order for dispensing for outpatients. So that leads us to the $64,000 question, which is there enough hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine actually to go around, and is this shortage really a big bunch of hooey? Actually, even though there is a lot of hydroxychloroquine out there, what really matters is who's holding it and whether or not those drugs are available for the proper use. What we know is that hospitals have the stockpile that they bought up between March 1st and March 17th. Whether that still exists or not, I don't know, but it was quite a high amount, and there aren't a lot of hospitals actually using this drug for the COVID-19 patients. So what are they doing with those drugs? Also, we know that hospitals can get more of both of these drugs from the Strategic National Stockpile because of the EUA. So hospitals can access that 50 million doses of hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine that the federal government has in order to treat inpatient COVID-19 patients. So between the two, the hospital stockpile and the amount that they can get from the Strategic National Stockpile, these two big bundles of drugs can only be used inpatient. Because remember, a lot of hospitals, they don't dispense outpatient. They hold these drugs for use for people who are admitted into their hospitals. So that means the rest of us who are out there looking for these prescriptions, whether it's for rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, or for treatment early, prior to hospitalization of COVID-19, there is in fact a limited amount that's in circulation and that's available. Many of these drugs are on allocation from the drug manufacturers, but we're seeing an increased demand because not only are the lupus and rheumatoid arthritis patients needing them, but also a large number of people who are infected with COVID-19. So we have a large population, in fact, a growing population, that is now trying to access a smaller amount of supply because the supply has been diverted earlier on, in my opinion, to the hospitals and the federal government. So until these drug manufacturers can ramp up and make them more readily available to the pharmacies where we can dispense on the outpatient, then that's where we're seeing the problems with the supply and the shortages. So what's next? What we know is that the doctors are being blamed for the drug shortage. You know, you've seen probably as early as March 22nd, days after these drugs actually did go on a shortage list, that stories began to run up on NPR, the New York Times, and various outlets that doctors are prescribing these without the proper legitimate medical purpose, either prophylactically or to their friends and family or themselves. There's also pharmacy reports that the prescriptions have increased substantially, and that was concerning to the pharmacists because of the limited number that they held in hand for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis patients. And of course, following this time in the last couple of weeks, we're seeing state governors issue executive orders as well as a number of state pharmacy boards issue emergency rules, emergency regulations that direct pharmacists to limit the amount that they can dispense of these particular drugs under certain circumstances. So that leads us to the end of part 1 of this podcast series, and a question posed to you for part 2, which is, are these government actions, both in obtaining large amounts of these drugs and taking them out of circulation, as well as these state governments and boards that are limiting the ability of pharmacists and prescribers to get these out to patients on an outpatient basis, are these government actions helping or hurting the public? Because overall, there's more of us out on the outpatient than there are currently on the inpatient basis. So a lot of the drugs are being held by a small number of organizations that are serving the least amount of people. Okay, so stay safe out there and stay tuned for part 2 of this podcast.
Please help support the show by rating and reviewing in Apple Podcasts. You can also subscribe to our Waitlist for Life YouTube channel. That's Waitlist, the number 4, Life, on YouTube. Thank you for listening to Doc Talk with Dr. Bond.